Hello there. Welcome to Intercept CSA, the podcast, where we break harmful silence with truth, healing, and protection, one conversation at a time. I'm Nadine Samson, your host and guide for this conversation. Thank you for joining me. If you have parents or people caring for children around you, do make an extra effort to have them listening. Place your devices beside them, invite them to lean in. Every bit of awareness counts for children. As we begin today's episode, I want to read you a line from the Center of Expertise on Child Sexual Abuse about the impact of child sexual abuse. In the opening of one of their research reports, they wrote, "Victim survivors of child sexual abuse can be affected in a wide range of ways, but the nature and the extent of the impact experienced vary. No two people are affected in exactly the same way. This means that victim survivors themselves are the best experts on how they have been and are being affected, and any attempt to understand the impact on an individual should begin with them." And this is a good place for me to start today. As someone with a lived experience of CSA, one of the greatest struggles for me was how differently the impact showed up in my life compared to other stories I'd heard and the way people responded in those stories. I wasn't fortunate to have listened to a podcast like this or have material like the one from the center. It was in the middle of writing my memoir that telling my whole story slowly led me to full acceptance, into finally coming to the point where I could say, everyone's story does not negate mine. I alone can tell the story of how this impacted me. I'm beginning here because at a foundational level, this episode maps out the known landscape of CSA impact. And I say known very carefully because there are so many untold stories, so many ways people experience and respond to abuse in ways we cannot cover because we haven't heard from them yet. The human experience is rich. People touch and carry pain in ways that are distinct. We see this diversity of impact in pregnancy, for example. Open any pregnancy thread, and you'll see how different a 9-month journey can be, even when the goal is the same. One person is talking about how they needed critical care due to past health conditions. Another is talking about how they've been healthy all their lives and had wild complications in pregnancy. Life is full and layered, and nothing we speak about here will ever be extensive enough to cover everything that could be going on with every survivor out there. So to anyone with a lived experience of CSA, no matter what we say or do not say, you are not overreacting. And if you don't see yourself in any of these experiences, that is not proof that nothing happened to you. Also, in the last episode, I hinted at something called intersectionality, though I didn't call it that by name. When I said the impact of CSA can differ from person to person, even in similar forms of abuse, I was pointing to a form of intersectionality. In that episode, I talked about how the impact of sexual abuse may look different in a child from a home that is full of love compared to a child already broken by parental separation, a child who already feels like God has cheated them or life has cheated them, like life has been happening to them negatively already. And when you picture it, you can also tell how overwhelmingly different the experience becomes in those two contexts. Or simply put, imagine two people who leave home at the same time and both of them reverse their cars and hit something. Depending on what has already been going on with their day up until that point, that car getting into an accident can either mean a mere accident or something that just happened, or it can be a big confirmation that everything in their life is falling apart. So the idea of intersectionality acknowledges that humans are complex and that life is rarely straightforward or linear. While one child is experiencing abuse, that same child may also be navigating poverty. They may also be bullied at school. They may also be in a church where intense purity sermons paint anyone who has experienced anything sexual outside of marriage as permanently damaged. And together, poverty, peer pressure, harmful religious ideas, a troubled home, all of that can shape what CSA impact looks like. It can also make it difficult to clearly assign any particular outcome to the abuse alone. if they have depression, for instance. It's hard to tell if the depression is caused by the abuse, the bullying, the grief of a family falling apart, or it is all of it combined. All of that overlaps and becomes tangled. Now, why should we keep intersectionality in mind? Two top reasons. One, because it helps us to stay person and context specific. It will help us not to expect two people who have suffered the same way to, or who have experienced similar violation to necessarily suffer the same way. It will also help us to support healing for survivors more effectively, because if you intercept abuse and rescue a child, healing may still feel far away if the other traumatic experiences they are going through remains the same. Like a child who has been told in therapy that abuse does not define them, but are attending a church that preaches total condemnation and permanent damage to survivors. So you see how that can warps. Just to add again, intersectionality also shows up beyond impact. It shapes access to justice and recovery. If two children experience CSA at the same time, but one is from a very wealthy, well-informed family, and the other is from a poor, uninformed one, there will be a gap. The child from the wealthier home is more likely to access the right knowledge, medical care, therapy, and the kind of support that sets a path to healing. Whereas the other child would take longer to heal or may experience prolonged trauma. Now that we've established the individuality of survivor experiences, which is very important as we talk about impact, and understood why impact cannot be isolated from a person's life context, let's step into what we do know about impact, things that have shown up again and again across research, report, and lived account. What happens after child sexual abuse? We found through countless stories and interviews that the body continues to tell the story of abuse long after the abuse ends. It could be for years, sometimes a lifetime, especially when there is no intervention. Now, let me explain this with an analogy I think perfectly captures how trauma works or lives in the body. Remember our earlier definition of trauma, that is not just a distressful event, but the way that the body and the mind begins to shape themselves in relation to that event. Like someone who was robbed at night and starts to sweat or panic once the sun goes down. Trauma is the imprint that a violation leaves on the body. It is how the violation continues to carry on with the person long after the act of abuse has stopped. Back to the analogy I said was perfect for understanding how the body continues to tell the story of abuse. So imagine wherever you are right now, whether you are jogging while you're listening to this podcast, or you're sitting or cooking in the kitchen, wherever you are, imagine that someone suddenly appears in front of you or charges towards you with a stern face and raises their hand as if they're about to slap you. What would you do? You'll flinch, right? And the reality is, no matter how in love you are with the person charging towards you or how friendly your relationship is, it will not stop you from dodging or hiding your face. Your body will still react before your mind catches up. Now, why is that? Why is it that even though your conscious mind believes this person would never harm you, for a split second you felt fear? I'll tell you why. It's because your nervous system, which is part of your body, has stored that combination of signals, that combination of a raised hand, a stern face, and sudden movement as threat. And whenever anyone moves in those patterns, your body acts as an historian and does not deal with that situation from present-day knowledge, but from stored memory. Now, how does this apply to survivors of child sexual abuse? For survivors of child sexual abuse, this reality of the body becoming altered by trauma is very expansive. It shows up in different ways, and in the future, we'll discuss it from a more technical perspective. But for this general awareness season, where I'm going with this is clear. So for survivors or people who have experienced the betrayal of child sexual abuse, the same way our bodies have stored the signals that tell us that we're about to get slapped, a survivor's body encodes or stores information about the abuse, and wherever the patterns in that information shows up, even when there's no real threat, it will still cause the survivor to react, just like in the case of a slap. For example, in this excerpt, from an essay by a male survivor called Brian Kennedy on Medium. He wrote, "Every time I started to get close to someone, my body remembered what it meant to be vulnerable, and my body told me to run." Every time. Meaning it had nothing to do with the reality of the situation. It had nothing to do with how safe the person was or wasn't, because the body had learned that trust could be mishandled. It began to flag every relationship that demanded trust as a threat. I've shared a similar moment on this podcast in episode 1, where I talked about my dentist visit and the experience of my body shutting down, even though it was an ordinary routine activity. Unconsciously, my body had registered everything done to me or done to it without my conscious participation as too risky. It had learned that to close my eyes and relax with someone I don't really know could lead me to trouble. And so it remembers, and from memory, it reacted. And there are lots of stories and lots of ways that the body tells these stories. Some people still have nightmares of the abuse long after the abuse had happened. In some cases, the nightmares are not even about the casual or the actual event anymore, but about some monster that is pursuing this child. So the child sleeps and is seeing monsters pursuing him or her, or about him or her dying. All of that is the body's repeated way of signaling to this child that we are not still okay, we are in trouble. Some other people have flashbacks. They are not sleeping or unconscious, but their minds keeps slipping back to that abuse scene over and over again. For other people, their body stores a particular sound or smell or touch as a sign of danger. So once the survivor hears that particular sound, whether it was the music that was playing as the abuse was happening, or the way the abuser used to dust their feet repeatedly as a normal habit or their normal habit, the body reacts like they are back to the scene of the abuse or to the moment of the abuse. Still in Brian Kennedy's essay, which will be linked in the episode description, he wrote, "I remember the silence. I never said a word during the abuse. I remember his cologne, cheap and stale." So he's describing his abuser was male and he's describing his abuser. "It can still trigger feelings of guilt and shame when I smell it today. I remember the pictures of fruit baskets on the terrible wallpaper. I remember focusing on the repetitive design, anything to live the moment." Now, did you notice that he said the cologne from the abuser still causes him to feel ashamed and guilty whenever he smells it in present day reality? And this abuse happened to him as a child, and he's an adult now, more than 2 decades afterward. It's been years, but the body has not left behind the connection it made between the cologne and his being violated. The same way I would still flinch if someone charged towards me sternly with their hands raised and aimed at my cheeks, even though I've not been slapped in years. And this mind-body connection to abuse, even years later, doesn't end with nightmares and smell and sound triggers. It goes on to anxiety and then something called hypervigilance in psychology. Let me explain hypervigilance. When a child is sexually abused, their body and their brain learns that the world is not safe, especially if the abuse was ongoing, unpredictable, or it came from someone they trusted. And remember that child sexual abuse is often a trust violation. So the child's nervous system becomes trained or gets trained to stay alert at all times. And this training is called hypervigilance. It is a survival adaptation. And what it is saying is that if I can just spot danger before it happens, maybe I can stay safe. So that's the mindset, that's the thinking or the thought process at work. And the child begins to survive from that point and begins to look at the world from that worldview. Over time, this becomes a chronic thing. And even when the abuse ends, the body doesn't get the message that everything is calm now. The brain regions involved in threat detection, especially the amygdala and hippocampus, remains active, many times overactive. And the result of this is that even as an adult, a survivor of child sexual abuse is always scanning for threat, even when none is there. They're always looking to their relationships. They're always doubtful. Is something going to happen here? There's always this feeling or a constant undercurrent of tension and fear. They are always experiencing trouble sleeping, relaxing, or trusting their environment, especially when it's a new environment. So, child sexual abuse doesn't just cause an emotional wound, it reprograms the nervous system. And anxiety and hypervigilance are some of the ways that the body is still doing its best to protect itself from the pain it is now familiar with. Some survivors also fall into depression, where they live with chronic sadness, grief, or a sense of emptiness they can't explain. For others, the pain is so overwhelming that they shut down emotionally as a protective mechanism. These are the kinds of people you may hear saying, "Oh, I've healed, it happened to me in the past," but continue to manifest the trauma in other ways they may not be aware of. Some ways that other people may be seeing and may not be able to immediately connect back to CSA enough to even help them, or enough to call their attention to it. Still on impact, even when survivors know that it is not their fault, they still carry this deep shame, especially if they were societal messaging, family messaging, which they are, and maybe even emotional and verbal abuse from the abuser, which is most times a part of the grooming process. And beyond the survivor, the impact of abuse extends to the way that they relate with the world. Remember, trauma is when a violating or distressful situation replaces the lens through which you view and experience life. For some survivors, they begin to submit to relationships or situations that are not good for them. Because they were stuck for so long in a helpless situation, they've now learned helplessness and begin to speak helplessness as a language. Everyone could be complaining about a guy that they're dating, but they don't see it. Same with men. So for a situation where they have absolute control, they can wake up and say, "I don't want to be in this relationship again." They don't see how to alter that reality because over time they've learned helplessness. For others, relationships begin to feel unsafe, even with those that they love. Many survivors just expect that people will betray them. They have it at the back of their minds. People will abandon them, people will harm them, and nothing beautiful actually thrives in suspicion. So CSA can also affect a person's understanding of boundaries and their understanding of their power to choose their fate, especially if the abuse happened in childhood. They struggle to say no or express anger because they learned that they were safer when they made others happy, even if it was at their own expense. A lot of people struggle with intimacy. Touch becomes invasive or triggering, even in marriage or in safe relationships. Some survivors avoid sex entirely. Others engage in it disconnectedly because they no longer know how to feel safe within their own bodies. Also, because early exposure to sexual activity led to feelings of shame and guilt, survivors, especially women, even when they are married, struggle with sexual expression because voices are still in their heads and they are still telling them that they are bad girls for enjoying sex at any point. An impact goes on even until when survivors become parents. For most people, it doesn't just go away. Some survivors struggle with overprotectiveness, where they are so afraid of what happened to them happening to their children that they unconsciously pass on rigidity, fear, and a distrust for the world to their children. And while it's important that children remember that bad people exist in this world, children must also be able to trust the world, to not feel like there is a target on their back at all times. Other survivors become parents who are overwhelmed by everything. They are unreliable at home, they get easily overstimulated. One minute they are calm, the next moment it feels like everything is after them. They are emotionally overloaded because they are still navigating their own trauma. Other survivors experience a disconnection from self. They don't know how to recognize their own emotions. They don't understand their bodies or their desires. They don't know how to communicate what they feel, what they want or need, because to survive, they once had to ignore all of that. Sometimes, too, in a bid to regain control, validation, or feel numb, some survivors experience hyperarousal or hypersexualize themselves. They're just trying to go back to a moment where they felt weak and be the dominant ones. They want to be able to say to whether it's male or female partners that I chose you or I'm having sex with you because I wanted to. Or maybe they are trying to convince themselves that sex means nothing and it's not something that it should have altered their lives. Many times this particular impact is misunderstood and criticized. So many people erroneously say you should hate sex if you were abused, but that is a misconception. The body makes meaning, and sometimes how it tries to survive is to dominate the circumstance they felt helpless in. For other survivors, without being aware, they unconsciously shape their lives around safety. They avoid certain places, relationships, or roles that feel risky. They don't choose anything unpredictable because they want to be able to remain in control of outcomes. Others push themselves relentlessly, trying to be perfect in order to feel worthy or erase the feeling of failure. Then we have addiction and self harm. Some survivors remember everything, others recall nothing until years later, when pregnancy or marriage or any major life event triggers the memory. Because to protect them, their brains had distorted or suppressed the memories of abuse to help them survive. There are a host of ways that child sexual abuse alters and changes a person's life. In one of our episodes, a male survivor in a short clip talked about how his grades dropped and his parents didn't notice. So, abuse in early years can interrupt brain development, can cause attachment issues, learning capacity issues, and emotional irregulation. Sometimes, some of the impact of abuse, like behavioral issues, fighting, anger, stealing, different things, and emotional instability is never connected to the trauma of CSA. So the caregivers, the parents, people around, the teachers, because they don't even know that abuse has occurred, because silence has forced this survivor into quietness, they are unable to tell that these issues that they are dealing with on a surface level is a reaction or an aftermath of CSA in the first place. Not to even talk about the isolation and loneliness that survivors feel. The way it feels like they're living in a parallel world where they are watching everyone else move freely while they remain stuck and burdened. They are surrounded by people, but they are completely alone. Trauma also doesn't only speak through emotions or relationships, it can leave deep physical imprints on the body. It's been discovered through ACA's research, that is, Adverse Childhood Experiences Research, that early trauma doesn't just affect the mind, it affects the immune system, the nervous system, the endocrine system. And over time, CSA survivors are more likely to experience chronic illnesses like diabetes, heart disease, autoimmune issues, and even increased inflammation. This is because survivors grow up with a nervous system that is wired for danger. The body learns to be under this constant guard and toxic stress. And that kind of hypervigilance, remember we talked about hypervigilance, takes a toll. Over time, it wears the body down. This is why many survivors report struggling with fatigue, hormonal imbalances, or chronic pain years later. It's been found that the trauma lives in their cells long after the experience is done. And I just want to say that none of these things that we've mentioned, because it's a general podcast and it's for general community awareness, none of these things means that you have experienced CSA that you may not have recalled or anything, or that the present heart condition you have or any other thing is directly linked to a CSA experience in the past. We're just saying that for some survivors, it's been found through adverse childhood experiences research that it can increase the presence or a history of CSA. It can increase their chances at experiencing heart disease. And remember, we also talked about intersectionality, which is the understanding that a human being has had multiple experiences in their lives. Multiple things have happened along the way. It's sometimes hard to establish cause and effect in these circumstances. The importance of helping you understand this connection is because you get to see why we can't wait and do nothing. When we also understand that the body remembers, we will treat disclosures with more sacredness and urgency. Because like Dr. Nadine Burke Harris, a pediatrician, public health advocate, and expert on childhood trauma, says, adverse childhood experiences and all that research has found as the impact of it is not destiny. It is not something that is unchangeable. Even if someone has experienced an adverse childhood experience like CSA, it doesn't mean that they are absolutely going to have these negative outcomes. Science and countless people who have recovered have proven that practicing mindfulness, meditating, faith for a lot of people are at, experiencing nature, exercising regularly, having safe, stable, and nurturing relationships can improve outcomes for people who have experienced adverse childhood experiences. It can improve their neurological functioning, their hormonal regulation, and their immune functioning. So there are lots and lots of ways that CSA continues to speak in a survivor's life long after the act has stopped. And while I've shared all of these harrowing details of the pain and hurt of child sexual abuse, I want to also talk to you and maybe even more to a survivor out there who identifies with all or most of these challenges. I remember sometime last month, I was in the middle of so much, trying to push through so many tasks, and one day I just paused and really took inventory of my life. And in that moment, I saw that I have completely missed out on something. You see, while child sexual abuse has bared its fangs and dug some painful wounds I struggled with through the years, I, as a person, in response to the turbulence inside of me, I grew a resistance that also grew me. I see myself now. I have an incredible ability to sit through discomfort and navigate situations that may cause other people distress. And while that may be disadvantages or that may sound disadvantageous to someone who hasn't healed, because I have healed and can take breaks when I need it, I've also learned to wield that resilience in moments where I need it, or in places or in points where it is needed in my life. And in psychology, that is part of what is called post-traumatic growth. Post-traumatic growth isn't exactly something we wish for because we hope the trauma never happened. Still, it is a testament of the power of every human being. Human beings are dogged people, and so are survivors. And while all of these are sad reports and we hope to prevent, disrupt, and heal people from child sexual abuse is not the end of the story and has not been the end of the story for many people. Some people have grown to value life more deeply and meaningfully because they've stayed in darkness for so long. So they don't share the trivial way with which some people look at the little moments in life. I went to speak at a church a little while ago, and in the middle, I raised my hands up and said, "Thank you, Holy Spirit, that my voice doesn't shake." It may be weird to someone else, but if you've been opportune to house the destructive drama that had sat in my chest for years and drummed panic, you'd be able to appreciate that moment. For others, or for other survivors, they've channeled their pain into advocacy and other causes that are changing the world. They've become bridges of hope and compassion. They see what others don't. They are more attuned to the struggles of others. They see people others miss because they know how to recognize the signs that others miss. They are people of capacity because they've sat with pain for so long that they've grown the ability to not tap out early. They've gone beyond survival and into resilience. They have a new purpose or renewed sense of purpose. Like Brian Kennedy writes in his essay, "Now I speak, and I speak with power, because the boy I was deserved to be heard, and the men I know who still carry silence need to know that they are not alone." That's the power in it. The boy he was deserved to be heard, and now he's becoming a man who can stand in the gap for people or for other men so they don't have to carry silence alone. Healing is not linear. Healing is slow, healing is filled with setbacks, but survivors do heal. They learn to shout again, laugh again, dance again. They learn to embrace a new life, chart a new path, find new meaning for their stories. They learn to recategorize pain. I'm in love with the word recategorizing pain, or with the idea of recategorizing pain. They learn to call them lessons, testament, emblems. But to every listener out there, all of that becomes a fight to achieve when children and adult survivors have to do that in isolation. This Impact series is about pointing you to a pain that is so real and painful, while calling you to an urgency to prevent and disrupt abuse, and above all, meet survivors with belief, respect, and care. Because healing happens when all of us stop asking questions like, why didn't you tell anyone? And start asking ourselves, what have we done to make telling possible? And what can we do to make sure telling is possible for everyone who has already experienced this, while we are blocking off gaps and while we're working towards blocking off every gap open to abusers to gain new victims? So this Impact Series episode was to pull together some of the ideas that we had shared in the last episode to give you a general view of what impact looks like for survivors of child sexual abuse, what life after child sexual abuse looks like, and to help survivors who may already have these challenges, who may already see some of these things show up in their lives and do not have language, help them have names, help them label and hopefully begin to walk the path towards healing. So thank you to every one of you who've sat through to listen and understand what the impact of child sexual abuse looks like at an overview. The first step to intercepting child sexual abuse is listening, and you've taken that first step. Well done. For this episode's call to action, we're inviting you to become a volunteer and join our mission to intercept child sexual abuse before it begins, to interrupt it when it's happening, and to support healing in those it has already touched. I don't believe that this is a work for professionals alone. This is a call for people who care, people who believe every child deserves safety, not someday, but now. People who believe that silence is too high a price for innocence. People like you. And you don't need to have it all figured out. You just need to care enough to begin, and we'll teach you the rest. Volunteer training begins this August. Together, let's become the everyday protectors children have always deserved. Sign up today with the link in the description. Be part of something that could change everything, for even one child. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Intercept CSA, and subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast so you can get notifications and be one of our first listeners. Remember, together we can intercept abuse and protect the children we all care about. Together we can intercept for future. Until next week, see you.